Hello, this is Zara Richter. This is the Facing Autonomy podcast. This is episode 3 of series 1. This time we are interviewing Ammar Ali Jan, a leading activist in the Pakistani left. With me for this interview, I have Shir Ali Khan, my co-host.
Yeah. And I'm really excited about this interview because Ammar has been not only a mentor, a close friend, a comrade, uh, and you know, uh, many of the topics that we'll discuss today, I think, are really crucial to not only understanding the movements taking place in Pakistan, but also in terms of developing a new left politics, I guess, and the current crisis of left politics is a great way of understanding what can be done and what sort of actions can be taken to develop our own politics in today's day and age, I guess. uh,
Thank you so much, here.
Okay.
Nice welcome. Thank you.
yeah. So I guess like starting out, you yourself did your PhD from Cambridge University in history, and you wrote your PhD thesis, which hopefully will be made into a book on Marxism in South Asia. And you returned in 2016 with a commitment of sort of organizing, but also teaching in public sector universities. But within a span of 4 years, you were fired on the grounds of national security from 2 universities. And more recently, you were let go last month due to your participation in this student solidarity march, after which you were arrested under the so-called the draconian anti-sedition laws over there, which have been used to target activists, workers, and scholars. So just give a brief background of what's been taking place and sort of the condition of public universities and why public universities were important in your mind for left intellectuals such as yourself to sort of be involved and be a part of.
Well, thank you so much, Sher and Zara, for inviting me to your podcast. Those are a lot of questions, so I'll just try to just focus on this one big thing about what's happening at the universities in Pakistan. As you mentioned, I returned in 2016 and for ideological reasons decided to work at a public sector university. And what I was promised was already very little. What I ended up getting was, for the first few months that I taught there, was less than $200 a month. Because I was made part of the adjunct faculty, and the situation is particularly exploitative for adjunct faculty. But what I realized was the bigger crisis on campuses was the fact that uh, there was absolutely no orientation for young people because there were no jobs. Um, Secondly, the quality of education was seriously in decline, partly because of funding cuts, but also I realized later, partly due to the fear of censorship. And that's the third big thing that from 2016-17, the Pakistani establishment was trying to was had already launched actually a major clampdown on free speech. So newspapers and social media and TV channels were being censored. And this was part of the restructuring that the military establishment thought was necessary to ensure the security of the nation. And it's quite fascinating that they came up with this term called the fifth generation war, which basically is this idea that wars in the 21st century will be fought through ideas and by seizing upon the impressionable minds of young people and Hence, young people need to be controlled. And where's the greatest concentration of young people? It's in higher education. So higher education became a major battle zone, and universities increasingly, I noticed, were turning into war zones, and not in the metaphorical sense of like battle of ideas, but actually areas where future wars would be fought and won. And anybody who was dissenting from the state's line was viewed as an enemy, not simply as a dissenter, but as an enemy. And it was a very peculiar situation, because at one level you have declining standards of higher education, and you have no future prospect for a lot of young people who are graduating. So you have all these students from lower middle class and working class backgrounds with degrees but no jobs. So they have a lot of questions about the system. At that time, the state was trying to suppress all questions. So naturally, there was a massive contradiction emerging in universities. And I chose to be a part of this battle, and I stood with students on questions ranging from the racism that was rampant, the militarization of campuses, the censorship, the sexual harassment, the discrimination against minorities, both ethnic and religious. And these questions are becoming more and more and more palpable, more intense on campuses. And I realized that taking a side means that you have to pay serious consequences. And I was fired from three places. One more thing that facilitated uh, the state in firing me is the fact that they have restructured labor. So now most young faculty doesn't get um, tenure track. So we're on contract. So they can refuse to renew your contract whenever. So it's a mix of paranoia, national security, censorship, and precarity of labor that is coming together to produce the current crisis on campuses in Pakistan, of which myself and many other people are victims.
Yeah. So Zara, you want to ask the next question, or should I? Um,
Um,
uh,
sure. I'm curious as to what your experience, Amar, was as a PhD student at Cambridge, and the difference between the situation of grad students or other education workers in the West and Pakistan. I'm just asking this question because our listeners are mainly not from Pakistan, and so our understanding of the difference in atmosphere will take more explaining probably.
Thank you for that question, Zara. Well, first I'll begin with the commonality. What I thought was common in both places is that young people were extremely upset. Young people were extremely skeptical, and we're talking about 2012. I joined Cambridge in 12, and this is a time when the UK government announced massive budget cuts to higher education. So there's massive austerity. And in 2010, 2011, there were massive protests across the UK. But there were almost riots in London by students because they tripled the fee for undergrads. Now, that didn't affect me directly because I was on a scholarship, but this was the general situation, and students were. This was, the peak of the Tory government, and peak of austerity 3-4 years after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. So there was a lot of discontent. Secondly, there was also a lot of exploitation of young teachers and graduate students who were made to work a lot for much less. And this is a generational thing that's happening. People who joined academia in the 80s and 90s or before that had some kind of job stability, and you don't have that anymore, either in the US or in the UK. So those things I found quite common in both at both Cambridge and in Pakistan. What's different about Pakistan, I feel, is that one, um, everything is more intense in terms of the crisis. So let's say a student from a UK university, a public sector UK university, um, has prospects of getting some work, maybe around £20,000 a year, £25,000. So that's not supposed to be really good as compared to what it was about a decade ago. And today in Pakistan, we're talking about people who actually don't find jobs at all for years. We're talking about mass unemployment, a little like the situation in the Arab world, particularly. One of the causes of the Arab Spring were precisely these young people, these surplus populations who had aspirations for some kind of a middle class life, but the reality was that they could not get any uh, place within the system. The other thing that's different is that you actually have a very different form of surveillance. So here we're not talking about just having spies, which you see on campuses in the US as well. We're also talking about um, people being threatened directly. There's a huge issue of enforced disappearances. Basically, by that we mean there are a lot of young people who have critical views towards the government. They go missing, which means they're abducted, and that's a very common phenomenon, particularly in the peripheral areas of Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, but also at times in Punjab and Sindh, which are two other provinces. So, these are the four provinces of Pakistan, the states. And it's so the fact that anybody who raises a question can be abducted is a very real possibility. Casts a very sinister shadow on any discussion one has with the youth. Similarly, over the past 2-3 years, I've seen my students being beaten up by right-wing student groups that are nurtured by the state. This one time when I was teaching at the state's university, Punjab University, I actually saw students being beaten up in front of me, and we had to intervene. And by beaten, I mean thrashed. They had to go to ICU, they had to be admitted into the intensive care unit in hospitals. And later, the government responded by imposing terrorism charges on the students who were beaten up, on the victims, because they were opposed to the government's position. Similarly, last year, um, there was a student solidarity march. And this would also be of interest to your listeners, because the demand of the student solidarity march was very simple. It was the right to have student unions. There are no student unions in Pakistan, like no graduate or undergraduate union, no representation for students at any university, at any level, which is something very different from what's happening in the UK. And for doing that march, which was a massive success, it happened in over 40 cities. The next day, a student was abducted, and 5 people, including myself, were charged with sedition, which carries life imprisonment. I'm still facing that case. Um, and that's something I would not have expected in a place like England. But, even there, things aren't that good. But I would have been quite sure that going to a protest would not mean that I'd be accused of being um, seditious, or at least the law would not view me as seditious. But here you go. Here, our friend, our student, was in jail for 4 months, and I'm still facing the case. And that just shows you the kind of intensity with which questions of militarization and surveillance uh, assert themselves in the lives of ordinary people here.
Yeah, I guess just like continuing the discussion, a major debate, in both Marxist theory and amongst various trends of Marxism, I guess you could say, has been regarding the centrality of student struggles and the university as a site of resistance. Uh, how have you sort of understood uh, that sort of element? Because the university can be a very contradictory place where there are students from different backgrounds, and there's an internal sort of class struggle within the student movement that's also taking place.
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the things in which the universities, I think, play an important role is ideology. Universities, primarily from the state's perspective, are sites of ideological training of future workers, bosses, and it imposes a certain hierarchy and prepares people for a certain hierarchy or certain responsibilities. And that's not just universities, broadly education, the way it is conceived by capitalism or capitalist states.
Mhm.
Um, our job, of course, is to turn this factory of ideology into a battleground
Mhm.
over competing ideologies. That is the nature of class struggle on campuses. So it becomes a very important battle, and there's, of course, there's that ideological side. Then there's, of course, the actual concrete fight over capitalist exploitation, which includes working conditions on campuses, the way students are treated in terms of whether it's harassment, whether it's discrimination, whether it's just like general intimidation or humiliation that a lot of young people face, which is an attempt to really evict any sense of dignity from students, from their consciousness, so that they can be manipulated and used by the system in a much easier manner. Because if you evict dignity out of a human being, then it's easier for them to obey the system, because that's where they'll find their being. That's where they'll find protection if they don't have self-confidence, if they're no longer centered. And that's I've noticed that's a very important thing that power does. It tries to disperse people internally, decenter them in a way that makes them vulnerable, so that then they can move towards power. Our job is to inculcate a sense of dignity, a sense of reason, a sense of self-respect in young people, and then young people, of course, have the capacity to find their own path, that they wish to. So there's that side, and there's, of course, the side of, like, the struggle against fee, the struggle against the lack of scholarships, the lack of jobs. So there's both an ideological dimension and a material dimension in terms of uh, the concrete material investments attached to education, which we've seen how in Pakistan over the last few years there's been massive austerity. I mean, Pakistan was already doing really poorly, even in the region, in terms of higher education. And last year, after Pakistan signed an agreement with the IMF, there was a 40% budget cut to higher education. So you can imagine there's an attempt to dismantle education. There's an attempt
Mhm.
to turn universities into technical training centers, and that needs to be resisted.
I want to intervene here a little bit because I noticed myself in the university in North America that between the state, which views education as training for capitalism or training for productivity or something like something which has a material outcome which is useful to the state and to capitalism, and of course the renegade education worker or professor or student who sees it as a battleground. There is this kind of middle class position that views the university as a place for knowledge's sake, right? And I'm familiar with a lot of people who are sort of middle class liberals, in the North American Academy, who will defend that the Academy's purpose is just knowledge for knowledge's sake. I haven't heard you talk about experience with people of that kind of view in Pakistan. Are there people in Pakistan who are saying, oh, it's only knowledge for knowledge's sake, and if we just stay away from politics, that we can avoid all of this. Is it difficult to meet colleagues who think like that, or do you meet colleagues who think like that, and how do you deal with that kind of a view?
Well, that's a global disease. It's not it's everywhere. This kind of politics in the name of anti-politics, and I think that's what it is. There's a very sinister, a subtle but very sinister politics to this idea that we're not supposed to be political. Um, what does it mean to be not political? And by not political, they basically mean don't take sides, right? I think that's where it all boils down to. But what does it mean to not take sides when a university raises fee of students, and all of a sudden some of your brightest students come to you and say, "Well, we love reading, we love education, we came from this far-flung village in pursuit of education, in pursuit of knowledge, and now we have to drop out because, well, the university administration decided that education can only be for rich people." Where does knowledge for knowledge sakes go then, when people are excluded from participating in the production of knowledge? What does it mean to be neutral when your female students come to you and tell you that their professors or their students who are repeatedly harassing them? What do you tell them, that it's harassment for harassment's sake, or what are you supposed to do? How What's neutral position over there? Or when you see your students being first beaten up and then arrested on terrorism charges for no crime of theirs except that they belong to the wrong ethnicity. Um, how do you take a neutral position? Where does knowledge for knowledge sake go there? So there are all these exclusions from knowledge that are happening. It's these are all attempts to exclude people, not just from university, but from society itself, and these are attempts to take away people's dignity. And if we're unable to take a position on that situation, in such a situation where you can clearly see a violation, where you can clearly see a certain idea being imposed upon the people, a certain logic of exclusion and humiliation and prejudice being imposed on young people, then I think it's hypocritical to say, well, I'm neutral in this. No, you're not neutral in this. You're actually accepting the logic of the system, and that logic of the system is cruel and exclusionary. So I think part of what we have to say, and I think you, Zara, you put it absolutely correctly, that this is a very middle class idea of this pure thing, that we don't get into this mess, we're just thinking about the general good. I think it's a cowardly position, because these people know that there's that the what they're calling neutral is already split. And one thing that I think, why I would claim to be a Marxist, or why what I like about Marx the most, is that he can see reality as being split, and it always invokes a decision. One has to choose sides, and either you can be with those people who are suffering and who want to amplify their suffering, and you become an agent of amplification. You stand with them, display solidarity, or you side with the oppressor. I don't think there's a middle ground here at all. It's a split reality. It's split between classes, between bosses and employees, between administration and students, between the oppressor and the oppressed. And I just don't see some imaginary neutral ground that these middle class liberals want for themselves. It could be a noble desire, but in a concrete analysis, every time it proves to be a cowardly position.
Thank you. That was so inspiring what you're saying here.
Yeah.
We do have to move to our next topic that we really want to talk to you about, which is the HKM movement, which you are a prominent voice in Pakistan currently, and also on after you briefly talk about the HKM movement, I want you to talk about, we've read some of your recent essays about the pandemic, and how that relates to the HKM struggle. So I want you to get to that as well after we start the HKM discussion.
Yeah.
So should I respond to this?
Yeah,
I
just
guess just
start
keep
out talking about the HKM.
Yes. So
just sort of introduce HKM, and then we sort of ask a couple follow-up questions, I guess.
cool. We Sher and I were part of the same political party, the Awami Workers Party, which was an attempt to bring together different left groups across Pakistan to build some kind. We were inspired by Syriza in Greece at that time, and now you can think we're naive, and we think that too. But I think it was part of the political process of learning, and we thought, if the left could come together, then we could become a force.
Yeah.
When I returned in 16, Sher was very bravely organizing a lot of young people, and he was working with feminists, with environmentalists, and really pushing the limits of debate in Pakistan among Marxist circles. And that I found to be very inspiring, and I was very happy to join it. Except um, it was clear that members of the old left felt threatened, because they weren't just threatened by the fact that they're young people who are more energetic. They were also threatened by the fact that they're new ideas that are imposing themselves, that are asserting themselves against these dogmas that these leftists had. And what were these new ideas? What were the problems that they had? They had a huge problem with feminism. I mean, feminism is probably the most hated thing among dogmatic Marxists, because they really think that they would have brought the revolution was it not for these women. It's this kind of like absolutely melancholic, delusional kind of thinking. So that was like a massive, and all of these young women in Pakistan, and women, trans women, they were asserting themselves, and this is still going on, and they thought of it as like some as maybe like heresy, because
Hmm.
it did not conform to the formulas that they were given when they joined the left in the 70s or 80s. So it's a
Yeah.
very formulaic conception of the left. Same with the environment movement. They were very pro-industry, and there was this entire Stalinist idea of like uh, building big industry, and all of a sudden you have these environmentalists in Pakistan who are saying, we have to think about sustainability, we have to think about our relation to nature, and they thought it was uh, uh, all a foreign agenda. So things like these, and we left the party together, and we formed the People's Solidarity Forum, and this was just like 7, 8 of us, including Sher, Sarah, and we had a group of friends, Comrade Ayman, Zahid, Umair, Hashim, Sarah. It was just a very small group in Lahore, and we started working, and our basic philosophy was that we're not going to claim we're a party, or we're going to like build something massive. Our basic thing is, wherever there will be a movement, a genuine form of resistance, we'll stand in solidarity with them, and we will connect them to other forms of resistance that are taking place across Pakistan and perhaps across the world. And that was a great experiment. I thought I'm very uh,
Yeah.
thankful to that decision we made, and we built. Uh, we stood with ethnic groups that were being targeted. We stood with feminist groups, with environmentalist groups, with workers groups, and
Mhm.
eventually in 2018, during the elections, we decided to boycott the elections and begin a new campaign, which we call the Haqooq Movement (HKM).
Yeah.
Basically, our point was to challenge candidates in town halls to actually speak on issues that matter to the people. So we began this campaign called "Pani Do Vote Lo," give us water and we'll give you we'll give you the vote, because 90% of Pakistan's drinking water is not fit for drinking. 40% of deaths in Pakistan are due to waterborne diseases. So, we thought it was like a very important issue, and we have to expose the system and expose even these liberal parties who claim to represent the people but are unable to do so precisely because
Yeah.
uh, they're unable to talk about issues that matter to people. And then we kept on working. We did this. One of the issues we took up was police brutality in the name of war on terror.
Yeah.
This counterterrorism department killed an entire family, including
Yeah.
a 13-year-old girl. And later we found out that the case was that it was a mistake, and there was no
Yeah.
accountability. So we planned march. It was called the Shahri Tahaffuz March, the People's Protection March, maybe that's, or Citizens Protection March.
Yeah.
And a day before the march, there was a raid at my house. I was uh, it was actually interesting. I was sleeping. My wife was awake. She's an American white woman, and she just woke me up. She said, "There's someone at the door," and I was like, "Okay." I checked, and we turned our cameras on, and we saw there were cops outside, and they kept on ringing the bell, and she was asking me not to go out, and I was like, do we have to go, because otherwise they can become more aggressive. And this is 4 a.m., by the way, in the morning, February 2019.
Mhm.
And we went out, and they said, that you were under arrest, and there are all these charges against you. And there were about 15, 20 people, most of them not in uniform, so they were part of the um intelligence agencies. And it was very scary because, we thought maybe they're about to whisk me away as, part of the missing persons. And
Yeah.
my wife just like, she heroically stood in the middle, and she's like, where's the warrant? And they had no clue. Nobody had ever spoken to them like that. And they're like, and
Yeah.
they're all like, who's she? And eventually they started they threatened me, but she wouldn't budge. And they're like, you know, what kind of a husband are you? Your wife doesn't even listen to you. I was like, so if the police, if that's what the intelligence agencies are forced to say, that means you're winning. If they're trying
Yeah.
to uh, provoke your masculinity, as like, I'm proud of whatever she's doing right now. But they arrested me, and I was released the day after. We did this march. It was successful, and then we did these protests against the IMF agreement that Pakistan signed last year, which
Mhm.
which required a lot of budget cuts. And this was last year in May. Then we participated in the Student Solidarity March, which was massive last year and led to sedition charges against us. And since COVID, we've participated in the labor relief campaign, where we've helped hundreds of families through to get access to food rations, because the state completely abandoned the people during the crisis. And we're working on that at the moment as well. And one more thing that we've become very active with is in the factory areas, where a lot of workers have been fired during COVID. So we are organizing workers, and fortunately, we've actually managed to get a lot of workers their wages and their jobs back. And that, I think, is something that has made the group grow a lot in the working class areas of Punjab. But one more thing I'd like to mention here is our work recently with doctors and health workers. Pakistan was the perhaps only place where doctors were beaten up and arrested during COVID, because they were protesting first against the privatization of healthcare that the IMF is imposing, and then they were uh, they 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 were also protesting against the lack of PPEs. And in Quetta, the western city of Quetta, they were arrested in early April, beaten up.
Yeah.
And in response, doctors in my city, Lahore, went on a hunger strike. Can you believe that? In the middle of COVID, doctors went on hunger strike, and we stood by them throughout. And because we thought, health workers are the ones who should be protected at this point. Instead, the government was pushing privatization in the middle of COVID. So we have a
I think
very strong position with the health workers as well.
I think before we move into like the concluding part of this podcast, uh, one thing I wanted to emphasize, being there for some of these events that took place, and especially the question, of the traditional or state left, right? And there's something about their character in politics, right? Uh, where there's almost little to no vision or larger sort of objective of politics. It becomes sort of catered around, either interventionism or sort of co-opting movements, and sort of not necessarily the goal of and the suspicion towards resistance taking place on the ground. Right? Any sort of big mass movement is seen as sort of adventurous and those sort of things. And I think it's important to, highlight that sort of thing in a time, especially in the U.S., where you're seeing, a huge backlash, after the debacle of Bernie, where a lot of energy was spent, sort of defending Bernie, and now you see Bernie defending sort of Biden, those sort of things. But when it comes to left organizing, the fact that within society you have to be rooted within society and always pushing for transformative change and sort of radical politics, right? Within the constraints that you're given. And I think that one thing which has always appealed to me, because I've known Ammar since about 2010, when I moved to Pakistan, we worked in the same independent newspaper for a week, and I didn't get to know him until a year later. And even we were a part of the Labour Party. You always wanted to push the labels of what is possible, and I think that is really important. Sort of how to understand what's taking place on the ground, but also building, solidarities between different classes, and sort of how do we create sort of autonomous worker power on the ground, or sort of support activities on the ground which are actually rooted within the proletariat and sort of the working class, rather than doing that. But also then the sectarianism, like we've seen on the internet, like you getting fired from a university for the third time, left groups coming out and openly attacking you, and not just attacking you before for being agent or these things, sort of the similar language to the state, right? Uh, how have you sort of dealt with that, and what has been your philosophy throughout? Because I've seen that, like with the organized left, you sort of put limits on how they could control you, or sort of how they could control the potential of politics, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Sheer, for that. And I, my base, I've been under attack from the right mostly, but also from these tiny Trotskyite left groups who think I'm not Marxist enough. But who cares? The issue is what I am and I'm not is completely irrelevant to the actual politics that's happening on the ground. And I think part of the problem with the traditional left has been its obsession with itself against the actually existing unfolding class struggle in society.
Hmm.
Leaders will emerge from among the people. They will emerge from real movements on the ground, and real decisions of strategic importance can only be made when people are participating in a process. And here's, I think, where I break from the dogma of 20th century Marxism. And a lot of young people, it's not my break, it's something that I think a lot of young people are
Hmm.
realizing, is that a struggle cannot be formulaic, cannot follow formulas, because it creates its own rhythm. You're facing a counter revolution, you're facing reactionaries, and the way they react determines what you're going to do, and what you do determines how they're going to react. It's a struggle, it's a process. And you can only judge a movement not through political philosophy. That's why I also, like, even in my own dissertation, I just dislike political philosophy as a field, if the way it's taught, at least, because there are all these formulas about what a good government should look like, how people should be managed. That's all nonsense, because you actually can only uh, be properly political in the radical sense if you're following an open-ended contingent struggle, a process.
Hmm.
So it's the process that must be given more weightage than your ready-made formulas. Which also means why my basic disagreement with liberal democracy is precisely that it tries to represent different interests. Let's say working class would be represented a little bit, middle class, then of course corporations are mostly represented by the system. But let's say even if you invert this and the working class gets represented, I don't think that's Marxism to have working class interests being represented.
Hmm.
The real issue is to 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 be in fidelity with the movement of the working class, which consistently exceeds all forms of representation,
Hmm.
which creates a new criterion for representation, which creates new frameworks for doing politics, so that your existing understanding of what can be represented and what is the working class interest or what is the interest of a certain group, that whole framework of positing interest is radically rethought by a genuine mass movement. And if we cannot
Yeah.
be open to that novelty that any genuine mass movement carries within itself, then
Yeah.
I think we're more like bureaucrats than actually materialist Marxists.
Yeah. And I think that's a good good concluding point to go towards sort of what you highlighted in your joint write-ups with Zaid Ali, who's another close comrade of us, regarding the need for mutual aid and direct action initiatives in working class communities, especially during the time of COVID-19. Uh, but also, you've highlighted in other articles, not just in the Pakistan Left Review, but the need for developing a new anti-imperialist politics or developing internationalist solidarities, which aren't rooted on like NGO sort of uh, relationships or sort of imperialist relationships, I guess you could say. Uh, what is Can you sort of expand on that and sort of utilize that as a starting point to talk, just like a concluding point to talk about right now what's taking place, like the role of worker power, the role of student power, feminist power, other powers, especially in a place like Pakistan, and maybe how it could be replicated in the context of the internationalist left or in the US or in other places.
Um, yeah, I mean, this is. I think the question of internationalism is central for any understanding of politics today, precisely because um, capital is organized at an international level. Capital controls us on an international level, and that I still think national terrain is important. Of course, strategies can only be made concretely within a certain national terrain. But if they're oblivious of the international obligations, then they will turn into social democracy, where you're just trying to satisfy your own public, uh, and you're not ready to confront capital. You're just ready to get concessions from capital, because capital is not American, it is not
Hmm.
Chinese, it is not Indian, or it doesn't have a nationality. Capital is truly today a global system. And if you are anti-capitalist, you mean you are against this entire uh, social relation that is truly planetary, and and your strategy has to be a planetary one, a global one, an international one. So it's not like a feel good thing to say we're internationalists. It concretely means that we cannot, for example, have a new Green Deal just for the US, because that means you're creating you're not disturbing the balance of forces elsewhere. So it
Mhm.
has to be, and you can't export pollution over there, or you can't just let those places be. There has to be a global issue. Similarly, with the weapons industry, similarly with medicine today. I mean, you can't really talk about healthcare without having some kind of a global strategy, and that's what the pandemic is teaching us, how intimately tied human beings are. And I think it's important in that sense to recognize that imperialism has a very real uh, materiality today in terms of the international financial institutions that are extremely organized, in terms of the global corporations that are extremely centralized, and the military might of the US and a few other countries that's extremely lethal and concentrated. So one has to start imagining that a future has to, if this entire infrastructure is meant to dismantle any popular uprising, then the popular uprisings or the popular movements also have to think strategically of how to dismantle this infrastructure. Because without dismantling this imperialist infrastructure, we will at best be able to give some relief to some people, but we will not be able to actually uh, recognize or confront the truly historical tasks that we face in our current moment, which is actually the annihilation of our planet, the possible annihilation of our planet. And for that, we really have to be internationalists, and we have to dismantle those centers of power that are too arrogant to understand the crisis that too many people around the world are facing.
Mhm. Mhm. All right. I think your turn now for uh, any question or comment, so we
I
can.
mean, I'm just very impressed with the breadth of Amar's analysis, as far as both a consideration of the autonomy of local movements, and and pushing back against certain levels of dogma on the old and traditional left. Um, uh, within within the United States, there's a tactical debate constantly between uh, people who are somewhat anarchists in their orientation, which is the bigger kind of strata of the left, and folks who are more Marxist but willing to compromise in various ways. In that case, what that means is that right now, two of the two largest organizations in the U.S. left are the IWW and the Democratic Socialists of America. Um, I'm uh, Ammar, have you seen a similar kind of face-off around tactics regarding the engagement with the state in the organizing that you have been or are doing with in Pakistan? Are there factions that are within the left that are working more closely within the state and claiming to be radical regardless, or are you seeing more of the left taking the position that we have to build outside of the state and give up on any hope from within?
Uh, that debate is less central in our part of the world, partly um, because the state is extremely brutal. So You don't have too many people who are saying that the state is the horizon of possibility. It's a very Western idea. Uh, I mean, one can say it's a 20th century idea, but it's still powerful in the West in terms of these broad left parties. Uh, we don't we don't have that kind of a debate in terms of how to engage with the state. The bigger debate here is in terms of how to organize among the public. That's where the differences become very clear. There is a group. So there's an entire group of leftists who feel that they have figured it out because they've read some mediocre, Marxist literature here or there, and now their job is to preach to the people, and the people always fail them. The people are never able to, fulfill the expectations of the Marxist intellectual, and I love the people for that reason. On the other hand, you have a different kind of a left, which is saying we have to actually look at the rhythms being generated from the grassroots. Look at the contradictions there. Look at the aspirations. Look at the creativity, the innovation. And I mean, just recently we were working in this working class area, and a number of women, very poor women, just asked to be brought to a protest in solidarity with workers in a city that's far away, but they said we want to go. And we're like, that's wonderful that there's this kind of consciousness of solidarity. But then when they were there at the protest, this one woman, this young girl, like she just asked to to be given a chance to speak. Now that would be impossible in a traditional Marxist setup, that some new random person is allowed to be on stage because, well, she hasn't read all the collected volumes of Lenin and Trotsky and who knows, all these people. And here she was, like, she spoke, and she brought everyone to tears. It was all this like suppressed anger, rage, and humiliation that came out through her utterances, and it was beautiful. It was moving. It was, I give speeches. I can't move people like that with Cambridge education. And here's someone who's probably never gone to school, and she moved the crowd. She charged the crowd. This is real leadership, and this is real change. When the speech, the bodies, the thoughts that are suppressed, they are allowed to speak. They when that I feel is the beauty of politics. That's why we do politics. That's, when all these people who are assigned places in society and are told that this is not the time to protest, not the place to protest, not the way to protest, this is not how you speak at a protest, and they violate all those boundaries,
Yeah.
and they present something new. That incredible moment, I think, is the moment of communism, because it undermines all the artificial logic that's given to maintain hierarchies. And these hierarchies, in such performative gestures, these hierarchies are destroyed by ordinary people. And I think that is where the left has to be today. It has to open itself up to these kinds of very novel moments in which people, through their sheer experience, through their sheer ability to condense what they've seen in life, what they've struggled. That moment is the biggest indictment over the system that does not value these people, that does not value a large section of humanity whose voices, whose ideas, whose bodies are suppressed to maintain a system that, frankly, nobody today says is working. It's a shame. Humanity can do better. And I think the left can also do better by just learning to listen and stand in solidarity with those who may appear to be not textbook Marxists or whatever, but who have a profound wisdom to give to any cause and to any movement of the left.
That was beautiful. And I think just Zara, do you have any last comments before we wrap up?
I think that's a really great place to stop. I'm quite inspired. I know, Ammar, you said that you couldn't inspire, but I definitely find your words amazing in this
Yeah.
interview. So thank
That's
you
very
so
kind.
much for what you shared with us.
That's very kind of you,
No.
Zara.
Yeah, and thank you for coming on. And I know you had to, go for a dinner or something. So I hope we can do another session soon. Maybe talk about sort of, your theoretical interests and those sort of things, and continue to have you on Facing Autonomy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sher and Zara, and yeah, best of luck with this podcast. And I'd love to be back.
Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank you.
Bye
Bye bye.
bye.
This has been the third episode of the first series of the Facing Autonomy podcast. Thank you for listening.
Yeah.